In the tail end of 2015, I was looking for a camera to replace my Canon 600D, preferably a camera that shot 4K, as most of my projects were documentary filmmaking and I wanted to improve the image quality of our work. My choices were limited, and many of them had very high price tags associated with them. One was from Canon, with the Canon 1DC, which costed $15,000. The other two were from Sony, the A7R Mark II and the A7S Mark II, both great cameras but still out of my price range. And the other two, the first ever mirrorless camera that shot 4K, the Panasonic GH4, and then its smaller sister camera, Panasonic G7, which you could get with a kit lens only for $800. So the option was to get one GH4 or two G7s. What did I do? I bought two Panasonic G7s. My name is Mohammed and welcome to the first ever episode of Camera Retrospectives, Panasonic G7. Announced on May 18, 2015, Panasonic G7 is a mirrorless camera with a 16 megapixels micro four thirds sensor. It could shoot up to 8 frames per second or 6 frames per second with continuous autofocus, 49 focus points with 0.07 seconds focus acquisition thanks to the depth from defocus technology, which at the time was actually new. As for video, it could shoot 4K up to 30 frames per second with a slight 1.2 times crop on the sensor. But most importantly, it only costs $700 or $800 with the 14-42 f3.5 to 5.6 kit lens. But in order to really appreciate the G7, we need to take a broader look at the cameras that came out in 2015. I'm only looking at the cameras that shot 4K. So with that in mind, other than the G7, only two cameras came out in 2015 that shot 4K. It was the Sony A7R Mark II and the Sony A7S Mark II. The Sony A7S Mark II was probably one of the most exciting consumer video-oriented cameras. It was the low light king thanks to its 12 megapixels full-frame sensor, but that camera costed $3,000. And so did the A7R Mark II, which overheated in 4K mode anyway. But let's go back and let's look at the other cameras that shot 4K at that time. I'm going to dismiss the Canon 1DC because at $15,000 that would not be considered a consumer level camera. So we only have the Panasonic GH4 left, which came out a year before the G7. Panasonic GH4 was a revolutionary camera that captured beautiful 4K video for under $2,000, or more specifically $1,700. So the G7 also shot the same 4K but for $1,000 less. You need to understand the significance of a camera that only costed $700 that shot 4K in 2015. Sure, it was lacking in the photography department. 16 megapixels was considered low even in 2015, since the megapixel war had already started with the Sony A7R Mark II and the Canon 5DS. But at that point in time, you came to Micro Four Thirds for two things. 1. Smaller cameras and lenses to travel with. 2. Video. And that's what the G7 offered that none of the Canon or Nikon DSLRs offered at the time, and wouldn't do so for many years to come. And all the other options were in a very different price range. This 4K capability and price combo saw many people move to Panasonic, including me, who got two Panasonic G7s, then upgraded into a Panasonic GH5 and a Panasonic G9. Hence why the G7 was such a hit for Panasonic. Two of my most popular videos on YouTube are the sample videos I shot with the Panasonic G7 years ago. So how is it like to shoot with in 2020? Let's find out. Being only $700 with all that it offered, Panasonic had to cut some corners to get the price down to what it is. As a result, this is one of the few Panasonic cameras that isn't fully weather sealed and feels rather plasticky in hand. However, the grip is great. In my Panasonic G9 review, I mentioned how the G9 is a revolution of the G7, so it's no surprise that the Panasonic G7 has great ergonomics. It has a 3-inch 1,000,000 dots touch display, and you can change all the settings and go through the menus just by touching the display. In 2015, it's 2020 and Sony just came out with a camera that you can control via the touchscreen. That goes to show you how ahead of the curve Panasonic was, at least in the LCD technology terms. In terms of autofocus, it's fast but not always reliable. Panasonic has come a long way since their 49 areas autofocus days. Video autofocus is basically unusable, and it lacks an AF joystick. The good news is, however, you can choose the autofocus points on the touchscreen, like this, and it works even when you have your eye up to the viewfinder. Speaking of viewfinder, it has a 2.3 million dot electronic viewfinder, which at the time was considered very high resolution. Even now, it's pretty decent. So how's the image quality? Well, I can say this. The move from 16 megapixels sensor, which both Olympus and Panasonic were using at the time, up to the 20 megapixel sensor was a huge improvement. But you have to look at it with 2015 eyes. This 16 megapixel sensor was much better than the 18 megapixel APS-C sensor that Canon was using in many of their cameras, both in high ISO performance and dynamic range. I remember when I got my G7, I took my 600D and made some high ISO comparisons. The G7 has less noise. And as you can see, even though the Canon has a bigger sensor, because it's older, it's being outperformed by the newer but smaller 16 megapixel sensor. And as for today, in 2020, 16 megapixels is still plenty for travel and personal photography, and with some good lenses, you can still get some fantastic images from these cameras. So overall, yes, it can be sluggish to shoot with the G7 in 2020, but I bet most mirrorless cameras from 2015 would feel sluggish today. So with that in mind, it's really not that bad. How's the video quality? Like I said, Panasonic G7 can shoot really good looking 4K resolution video. Recently, I shot 2 of my YouTube videos with Panasonic G7s, and nobody really noticed that I wasn't shooting with the GH5 or G9. I have shot hundreds and hundreds of hours of video with these 2 cameras. So rather than talking about it, I'd rather show you. I bought the G7 primarily for video work, but I fell in love with taking photos with it all the same. This was my first mirrorless camera experience, and you could say I was an early adopter of the format. I was singing its praises long before Canon and Nikon tried convincing DSLR shooters to switch. I was already there, and sure, 16 megapixels might have been a bit on the low side, but with good lenses, the results were nothing short of excellent. 1 year later, the G7 would receive a successor in the form of the G85. The G85 didn't do much to improve on the G7. All it did was add IBIS, in-body image stabilization, and weather sealing. But it sold really well, which goes to show you how ahead of the time the G7 was. But all good stories have to come to an end, and for us, as our work grew more and more, we found ourselves in need for better cameras. So we replaced our 2 G7s with a G9 and a GH5. Panasonic G7 was lightning in a bottle for many people. It almost felt like it shouldn't exist. But Panasonic was being aggressive with packing all their technologies into their cameras. It was a move that paid off for them, and it's a strategy they're still maintaining to this day, with the recent release of the S5 being a mini S1H. I feel like we should applaud Panasonic for being bold enough to blur the lines between their own models. So I hope you guys enjoyed this camera retrospective on the Panasonic G7s. If you would like to see more camera retrospectives, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to my channel. Till next time.